Hello, everyone, and welcome to CFN. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor for Catholic Family News. Very happy to be back. We did our weekly news roundup yesterday. Brian is away, as I've said before. If you could pray for his father in this trying time, that would be great. We went over the Charlie Kirk assassination and all of the details surrounding that yesterday. If you want to go to our live tab, that's where you can find that here on YouTube. On Rumble, it should just come up as one of our streams, and Twitter, it should be one of our past posts as well. But now we're going to be looking more and more at church news. Of course, church news was connected to that assassination attempt, but there is another very significant event that has happened within the Catholic Church that we need to go over, which is that Pope Leo XIV gave his first really official long-form interview. Now, he's done little things here and there. Of course, he's had various addresses. He's spoken to various people. So it's not as if he's been in hiding all of this time. But this is his first really long form. He's sat down. He's had to take questions from a member of the press and actually give a full interview. A brief word on that. So this is a 6-part interview. Which it didn't need to be done like that. But it's a 6-part interview online that has been published by Crux. Crux is sort of a middle of the road. Maybe you can see them as leaning conservative or liberal, either way, middle of the road Catholic outlet. And in my opinion, they did a terrible job with this interview, just awful. The way they recorded it was terrible in the first place. The audio equipment they used makes it sound like he's in a tunnel. And I think some of the questions were a missed opportunity. There were some moments where I think they needed to press His Holiness more, especially on some of these more controversial issues. And it gave the impression in some areas, and we're going to go through the whole thing, that both sides had no idea what they were talking about, that they were sort of talking about the issues, around the issues, rather than actually engaging the important points. And that I think has led to some ambiguity afterwards, and that's always troublesome. And the other thing I'll mention is also just this strange 6-part, you make us go to a different tab to finish the interview. I would have preferred just a full transcript that they released. I've noticed some people only read 1 or 2 parts of this interview, got a very small amount of what the interview was actually saying. And that's because they didn't have access to all 6 parts, because it's so difficult to sort of maneuver. So we're going to go through the whole thing. We have all 6 parts here. One of the parts is mainly just a repeat, literally a cut and paste job of one of the first parts. I guess they made a mistake on that end, but we're going to be going through all of it. I want to talk a little bit about the reaction so far to this, which has been a lot of people saying the sky is falling. And we've seen this a lot since Pope Leo's the beginning of his pontificate. There was a pretty strange reaction in that a lot of people were very pessimistic the moment he was elected. They switched on a dime, I think, after they realized they didn't do a whole lot of research into who Cardinal Prevost was. A reminder, we had Prevost as one of the top 3 candidates for actually becoming Pope. So we were very acquainted with who the man was, even though there were a lot of unknowns about him. And then a lot of the people who were very critical of Francis were optimistic, but then gradually have come to the sky is falling position. And I will say, I think that's unnecessary. I've continuously said that I think we need to move away from a sort of black and white mentality if we're going to say that the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church, it's this church set up by Christ, and that Pope Leo XIV is occupying the chair of Peter. I think we have to be careful in saying that everything he is saying is bad, and we need to characterize him as being a false prophet in everything he is saying, or saying that everything he says is good. Rather, I think we have to have a general disposition of saying, okay, we're going to hear out what the Pope has to say. We're going to try to make connections with what we know is the established truths of the faith. But if it causes us to be completely rejecting what has come before, dogmatic truths that came before him, then we have to say, no, previous teachings outweigh what the current Pope is saying. We're going to have to go with the Catholic faith instead of that. And the problem of the crisis in the church is that the lay faithful and the priests as well have had to do that more and more. And so the process of looking at this interview is going to be to see, where is this pontificate going? It's going to be finding some of the problematic areas that I think we should be on the lookout for, and really shield ourselves to and study more. But I think also call for the hierarchy to look into more and to really make the teaching on this solid. And also to just explore the what are the truths of our faith more. We use this as an opportunity to explore the faith. I don't want this to turn into, we're doing this in order to advocate that the sky is falling, you have to be despondent and think that that there is no hope in the Catholic Church. That's not the end goal of this. I've stressed the importance of people going to safe Catholic communities where you are going to be able to trust your pastor, you're going to be able to trust the community around you. But if you're going into a traditional Catholic community, it is not necessary that you couple that with hating every single statement that the Pope makes, thinking that everything he says is a part of an agenda to make you to go to hell. And that might be a straw man of some people. There certainly are some people that hold to that. And I think there's an increasing number of people that advocate for that position, thinking that they sort of need to evangelize to people that this is almost like an antichrist preaching. So that gets that sort of preface out of the way. Let's jump right into the first part. And we're going to have to be switching between tabs a lot here, but I want to skip over some of what he said at the beginning here. It's simply unnecessary, where, they're asking softball questions. Who are you rooting for in the World Cup? The one thing I will say that's very interesting is they ask him, you're from the United States, but you're also the second pope from Latin America. Who do you identify more? Who do you identify with more? And what he says is that he does identify with Peru and Latin America more as well. That's what he seems to say. And he says this. He says, I believe that connection with Latin America was significant in both my connection with Pope Francis, my understanding of some of the vision that Pope Francis had for the church, and how we can continue to carry that on in terms of a true prophetic vision for the church today and tomorrow. So we talked about this a lot, Sarah Vervai and I, when we were analyzing Cardinal Prevost at the time, seeing, is this a possibility for him to get elected? We said that he's less of an American pope and more of a Latin American pope, a cardinal, and that would make him more of a candidate that would be accepted by the cardinals. And it seems like we were right on that. He seems to have that identity less of being, I'm a red, white, and blue American, and more, I'm identifying with the Latin Americans. And I'll say even the way he speaks seems to be connected with what you would expect from a prelate from Latin America to be saying. So moving on to some of the more serious questions here, he says the question is, you're in your first few months as Pope now. How do you understand the role of the papacy? He talks about it being a sort of learning curve for him. He's having to learn a lot. The last paragraph is the most significant for our purposes. He says, being Pope, successor to Peter, asked to confirm others in their faith, which is the most important part, is also something that can happen only by the grace of God. There's no other explanation. The Holy Spirit is the only way to explain. How did I get elected to this office, to this ministry? Because of my faith, because of what I have lived, because my understanding of Jesus Christ and the gospel. I said, yes, I'm here. I hope to be able to confirm others in their faith, because that is the most fundamental role that the successor of Peter has. Okay, some significant things there. One is the Christological connection. We've stressed this a lot in our analysis of Pope Leo XIV. He does believe in Jesus Christ, the risen Savior. If there's any doubt about that, I think it's constantly dispelled by every single document that he puts out and every single statement that he puts out. He does seem to have a connection with Jesus Christ and the Savior. He's also continuously talking about the gospel. Now, a problem is that He very rarely defines what the gospel is. In some cases, he seems to mean that those are just the messages contained within the four gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In other places, he seems to think it's an underlying principle of sort of a following of the picking up your cross. He seems to mean that. It would be very helpful in some of these future questions if he were to define that. And I wish that the interviewer, noticing that he's constantly referencing the gospel, would have asked him, what do you see the gospel as being? Because it should not just be a vague term that you can sort of get out of a question with. It needs to, the gospel is something very fundamental, and he obviously believes in something. There's something that he's talking about there, and it's important that we get a straight answer as to that. Second thing that you also see is this notion of him being the successor of St. Peter. That's very important. I don't think it's something he's entirely internalized yet. And we'll notice this in the future questions. I don't think it has really come to terms with the fact that he is the Pope and that he's the one that's going to be in charge. He'll talk about the church almost in the third person. And I don't entirely see that as this is his understanding of the church and the magisterium. I get the sense that he just hasn't internalized this yet, that he is the successor of St. Peter. But I think one of the things to be optimistic about is that he believes that he is the successor of St. Peter, that the Pope is not just one bishop among many. He has a unique role. And so this is, I think, an optimistic paragraph we can take, but it's one where there's a few ambiguities that need to be answered. Okay, moving on. He says, and now we're getting into foreign policy, something that is stressed a lot about throughout this Crux interview. They say, you've been advocating for a lot of peace in various conflicts, but Ukraine has especially been prominent. How realistic is it for the Vatican to be a mediator in that particular conflict at this moment? He says, I'd like to make a distinction in terms of the voice of the Holy See and advocating for peace and a role as mediator, which I think is very different and is not as realistic as the first one. I think people have heard the different appeals I've made in terms of raising my voice, the voice of Christians, the people of goodwill, saying that peace is the only answer, the useless killing after these years of people on both sides in that particular conflict. But in other conflicts, I think people have to be somehow wakened up to say there's another way to do this. He goes on and says, to think of the Vatican as a mediator, even the couple times that we offered to host meetings of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, either in the Vatican or some other church property, I'm very well aware of the implications that are there. Now, some people might say that, and he has two other paragraphs there that are really just trying to, I think, inspire the hopes of people. I think the thing that people are going to draw from this, if there is anything there, and Pope Leo is pretty selective with his word choices, I do think he's moving the church away from trying to make the Vatican this international mediator. I get the sense that he realizes that didn't really work during Pope Francis's pontificate because there are political things at play that make it so that it's not very useful. And he's going to talk about the role of the United Nations here next, and it gets a bit fuzzy here. He seems to almost be pessimistic about the current state of the church and international politics and how these things are working together. He seems to be pessimistic. I think if Pope Leo is going to make any major changes early on into his pontificate, I would guess that this is one place he would start with, which is moving away from the current status quo of how the church works with international relations. He seems to want to get away from that and turn it into something else. It might be that the Vatican is more of a more focused on sort of the spiritual needs of people. We've heard rumors that his next encyclical, his first encyclical, will be on the spiritual and temporal needs of the poor. But it definitely doesn't seem like he's seeing the Holy See as being this institution that is sort of meddling in the affairs of these various multinational organizations. That's the impression I got. Maybe you have a different impression of that. That's what I gather from that answer, that is sort of dodging the question, but yet still putting some things out there. He certainly is not enthusiastically talking about the Holy See as we're going to be a mediator, we're going to solve the war with Russia, we're going to solve the war in Gaza. He doesn't seem to be doing that. Now, here is a bit more of a controversial point. They asked him, you spoke about peace and building bridges in your first speech on the balcony of St. Peter's. What are the bridges that you want to build politically, socially, culturally, ecclesiastically? What are those bridges? Before we get to his answer, I want to remind everybody of what was being said at the time. There were a lot of people doom posting, taking the black pill as soon as this post came, as soon as Pope Leo said building bridges, because they said this is an explicit reference to Father James Martin. Now, I'm not saying that we're, based Pope Leo, he actually hates Father Martin. That's obviously not true by his meeting. But what I do think you can pay attention to here is that he did not mean the building bridges point to mean a reference to Father James Martin. Here's how he answers that question, which if he was that sort of progressive activist pope, he would have referenced Father James Martin's book here, but he didn't. He says this: first of all, the way of building bridges is primarily through dialogue. We'll talk about that. He says, one of the things that I've been able to do in the first couple months is have at least some kind of dialogue. Visits with world leaders from multinational organizations. In theory, the United Nations should be the place where many of these issues are dealt with. Unfortunately, it seems to be generally recognized that the United Nations, at least at this moment in time, has lost its ability to bring people together on multilateral issues. A lot of people are saying you've got to do bilateral dialogue to try to put things together because there are obstacles in the way of different levels for the multilateral things to proceed. He says, we have to continue to remind ourselves of the potential that humanity has to overcome the violence and the hatred that is just dividing us more and more. We live in times when polarization, this is a term that he mentions for the first time, pausing here, that's going to be mentioned throughout this interview, and it's an important one. He says, polarization seems to be one of the words of the day, but it's not helping anybody. Or if it's helping anyone, it's very few when everyone else is suffering. So to continue to raise those questions, I think, is important. Very important things in this section. First is that this is a conservative talking point. He says, unfortunately, it seems that the United Nations is not bringing people together on multilateral issues. That's encouraging because he's obviously not looking at the United Nations in a sort of idealistic sense that, yes, the United Nations is perfect. It's bringing everybody together. It's going to solve world problems. It's the end of history. Paul VI and Pope Francis tended towards that perspective, I think, almost that like, we're on the verge of a utopia, and the United Nations is just the answer to these questions. We don't need to look to any other solutions. Pope Leo seems to be completely moving away from that, and that's a good thing. I think moving us towards a new perspective on how to deal with international relations, especially on if we have a realistic foreign policy, which I'll give Pope Leo credit, he seems to have, especially on the crisis in the Middle East. I think that's a good thing. As I said, I think if we're going to expect anything in the first few years of the Pope Leo pontificate, the Leonine pontificate, it's a transformation of how he sees the church working with international relations and how it's encouraging the world to go about international relations. The other thing he is saying, again, I mentioned this term polarization. He says it's not helping anyone. I don't know if anybody says it's helping anyone, and I don't really know what he means. Maybe he just sort of was tripping over his words. Again, this is all in English. This is not the translation, so nobody can use that as a sort of excuse. But I don't see anybody saying, yeah, polarization is a good thing. Yes, people are going to be bringing people together. That is something we would want, ideally. But that's going to have to be answered. What exactly do we mean by that, and how do we bring that about? And that's what is asked next. They said, that was actually my next question, polarization, because that's a buzzword today inside the church and outside. How do you think it can be solved? He says, it's one thing certainly to raise the issue and talk about it. I think it's very important to start a deeper reflection of trying to figure out, why is the world so polarized? What's going on? I think there are a lot of elements that have led to this. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I certainly see the reality in some of the results. The crisis of 2020 and the pandemic certainly had an effect on this, but I think it began further back. Perhaps in some places, the loss of a higher sense of what human life is about would have something to do with that, which has affected many people on many levels. The value of human life, of the family, and the value of society. If we lose sense of those values, what matters anymore? Pausing. That's great so far. I'm glad he didn't just identify it with the social economic factors of 2020, because that's not what caused the polarization. As he rightfully points out, it's a loss of faith, and it is a loss of true. I know some people are going to say, why didn't he mention the gospel in the particular context here? Well, it's because many people are post-Christians entirely. I think that's a realistic perspective. Many people they're not acquainted with the gospel at all, and they've lost any sense of what human life even is about. And that's the big struggle, I think, with these shootings that we've seen recently. We've talked about that a lot on the show, is this absolute nihilism, this hatred of human life, and the complete loss of what human life is actually all about. So he's right there. That's something he's completely right. He's not identifying it with the sort of liberal perspective on social economic factors. He's identifying it with nihilism as connected to what is going on in a post-Christian world. So that's positive. That's something to build on. He then talks about the social economic factors here. He says, on top of that, there are a couple of other factors, one of which I think is very significant: the continuously wider gap between the income levels of the working class and the money that the wealthiest receives. And he talks about, Elon Musk, the wealth disparity. And again, some people are going to say that's socialism. It's not. If you've read Catholic social teaching, we have an economic series that we're actually currently working on. And if you go click on go to our locals page, Brian McCall's lecture on economics in the Father Fahey conference goes into this. We also have 3 articles on our website. If you just type in the economic debate, we go into some of this. Catholic social teaching wants a distribution of wealth that is just and fair. And I don't think that is actually being achieved today. And so this is not some kind of lib talking point. There is a real sense in which wealth needs to be distributed on a wider scale, and it's not being done at the moment to a sufficient degree. The economy is a moral factor, and it needs to work for the salvation of souls. You can't have people unable to achieve any of their needs and their duties, which is the basis of rights, of you actually having rights, are your duties to God, and to actually fill your duty of state. And if you can't achieve that because you're being put down by economic factors, that's a problem. And he doesn't seem to have articulated this completely. He seems to sort of be revolving around buzzwords with talking about Elon Musk and everything. But there is something very true to that. And if he articulates an encyclical, that would be a positive thing. Going on, he says, they ask him, I think the concept of synodality is still something many people struggle to understand. How would you define it? He says synodality is an attitude, an openness, a willingness to understand. Speaking of the church now, this means each and every member of the church has a voice and a role to play through prayer, reflection, through a process. There are many ways that could happen, but of dialogue and respect for one another, to bring people together and to understand that relationship, that interaction, that creating opportunities of encounter is an important dimension of how we see our lives as church. I don't mean to be cynical, but this is all just, this is very cynical of me, but it's gobbledygook. I don't think there's actually a whole lot of substance into defining what synodality is, especially when we have an actual historical process of what synods looked like before. And that's not, it's something you should expect from Pope Leo. If you are thinking that in order for there to be a valid pope, the pope needs to be a very articulate, high information person, you're not going to find that in the entire episcopate. The episcopate in general is actually quite low information and isn't going to be able to have a vast historical knowledge and understanding of each and every one of these terms. They're going to rely on some buzzwords and some very vague ideas like this. So, what is an encounter? Opportunities of encounter. What are we talking about? If we're talking about, well, the church has a voice, everybody has a role to play through prayer, reflection, and a process. Well, what's the difference between that and what the church has always done? Everybody's always prayed in the Catholic Church, right? Everybody's always reflected in the Catholic Church. So what are we saying here? Now, he's going to come out and really dispel some notions of what synodality is not, which is a good thing. It's actually quite conservative. But this is a thing where I get the sense that Pope Leo has come into this, and they're like, this is what Pope Francis was about. Here are the buzzwords attached to it. Go with it. And he's adopted the buzzwords, but he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's like, well, what is this synodality thing anyway? Do I really know what any of this is? There's no substance in that paragraph. Now, he says this. Some people have felt threatened by that. Sometimes bishops and priests might feel synodality is going to take away my authority. That's not what synodality is about. Maybe your idea about what authority is somewhat out of focus, mistaken. I think that synodality is a way of describing how we can come together and be a community and seek communion as a church, so that it's a church whose primary focus is not on an institutional hierarchy, but rather on a sense of we together, our church, each person with his or her vocation, priests or laity or bishops, missionaries, families, everyone with a specific vocation that they've been given as a role and something to contribute, and something we look for the way to grow and walk together as a church. Again, I don't think that means anything. Is there something of substance there? No, I really don't think so. I don't think the Pope is actually saying anything there. There is no... just as a quick example, right? If we say synodality is something unique, well, and the thing that makes it unique is that we have a sense of our church or we together. What are you talking about? Right? What makes that unique? That's not an answer to the question. Again, I just think it's something Pope Leo has stepped into, doesn't know what it is, and is adopting the buzzwords of the time. If the Catholic Church is to do anything good with synodality, the best thing it can do is abandon it. We have an article from Philip Campbell talking about the importance of synods. The Catholic Church has always used synods. It's a core part of the Catholic Church. It's always been a part of the Catholic Church. Synodality is really just a buzzword that I think means let's get together and talk as a whole church. And nobody has really figured out what it means. And it's been used by a faction of the church to push ideas forward. And Pope Leo mentions that. We're going to get to it. He says, it's an attitude which I think can teach a lot to the world today. A little bit ago, we were talking about a polarization. I think this is an antidote. I disagree. I think people, in order to get past the polarization, you need clarity. This is me speaking. This is not true. Synodality, a bunch of vague buzzwords is what's going to get us through polarization? Absolutely not. Now, he mentions the problem here. He says this: I do very much hope that the process that began long ago before the last synod, at least in Latin America, I spoke about my experience there, some of the Latin American church has really contributed to the universal church. I think there is great hope if we can continue to build on the experience of the past couple years and find ways of being church together. Now, pausing really quick, there is something to the idea that the church needs, in the fact that it's more global than ever, there is a need of each individual region to communicate with the other bishops of the world in order to gain a greater context of what the Catholic Church is. Because if you're, as a great example, the bishops in the Netherlands right now, in Holland, desperately need to be told about what Catholicism is from the mission churches, because they've lost the plot completely. Their idea of what Catholicism is some social group that is promoting liberal ideology and bringing us back to a sort of 1960s utopia. They need to be told by some of those African bishops, no, we're about preaching the gospel and saving souls, because you've got these people possessed by demons and going to hell. That's what they need to be told. And if that's what synodality is about, fine. But at the moment, it's just a bunch of nonsense. And it's been used improperly. He says this: I think there's great hope we continue to build together, not to try and transform the church into some kind of democratic government, which, if we look at many countries around the world today, democracy is not necessarily a perfect solution to everything. That's great. That's true. And that's been the traditionalist critique of synodality for a long time. Democracy has really failed in the Western world. It hasn't done a very good job of preserving really any kind of the institutions in the West, and it's been a major problem. And applying that to the church, again, just makes everything relative. He says this: but respecting, understanding the life of the church for what it is saying, and we have to do this together. I think that offers a great opportunity to the church, and offers an opportunity for the church to engage with the rest of the world. Since the time of the Second Vatican Council, I think that's been significant. And there's been a lot to be done yet. Well, you would think after 60 years, there'd be something significant that would have come out of that process of the Second Vatican Council of trying to engage with the world. Again, this is me speaking. That certainly hasn't happened yet. I don't think the church has effectively engaged with the world at all since the Second Vatican Council. It's completely failed in that regard. So I think trying to use some of that, look, the church needs to engage with the world. Absolutely. But if we're doing it in this sort of failed way that of the 60s, it's not going to work at all. It's not going to do anything. It's going to disengage the church from the world because it's not working at the moment. So the second part here, let's pull it up. Again, it's a 6-part section of interviews that was done. It's kind of complicated to move back and forth with all of these because there's like 6 tabs open up, but let's see if we can get it here. All right, here it is. Second part with Crux's Elise Ann Allen on relations with other churches. He begins here with ecumenism and AI. We're just going to talk about those 2 parts here because we still have a lot to go. But he says, the question is this: another potential challenge, something that all of your recent predecessors have prioritized, and I think Pope Francis certainly with a new impetus, is the topic of ecumenism. What will your approach be? Okay, there's a lot to work through here. He says, absolutely. I think that the recognition from the time of the Second Vatican Council of trying to work towards an authentic unity of all Christians has to be one of the goals of the church today. One of the deepest wounds in the life of the church today is the fact that as Christians we're divided. Okay, pausing there. I despise when this is mentioned. And this is such an oversight by the vicars of Christ, because the church has for 2,000 years always stressed this. And this is something that the fathers stressed immensely, which is that the church is not harmed by, it does not lose its unity by people leaving it. It might do so in an analogous sense, but it does not lose its essential elements of unity by you and you in your pride leaving it. Because the church is always going to be one. If we profess that the church is one, holy, Catholic, apostolic, how can we maintain that if we say that it is no longer one once schismatics break off from it? Because then our creed is in vain. And so when we say that it's a wound and we're breaking off the unity, I think it's no longer that, again, in the 1960s, that might have been popular to say, but I don't think that's something that we need to hear right now. Now, I do think there is something about bringing, and as he says, there is something true about the fact that those who believe in the Trinity, in the basics of the gospel, and even Garrigou-Lagrange talks about this, there is something that is more fundamental that unites us there than what we would say with the Muslims or the Buddhists or the Jews. But still, I think there's a problem here. when talking about ecumenism in this way. Now, it's not as radical as what Francis would say here. That's very clear. Now, he did talk about then how he's working this with the Eastern Orthodox. The only thing I'll mention here, because again, we want to move through a lot of this, is the Gregorian and Julian calendar. He's saying there are a lot of things that have taken place in history of the world that have continued to divide. Who believes in this? Who believes in that? What's the role of the Bishop of Rome within the world of believers? But we have to keep working on this. A very concrete issue is finding a common date for Easter. I want to back up a little bit up because this is more fundamental. I do think he takes a more conservative view towards ecumenism, if we can even say that. I mean, the most conservative, really Catholic view of ecumenism is to condemn it. But in this sense, I think he takes a more acceptable view where you could say, well, if we're saying that the Bishop of Rome is trying to communicate to the other lost ecclesial communities that they have fallen away and that the Bishop of Rome can solve their problems if they join Catholicism, and that we can make some certain concessions to them, not on doctrine, but on various disciplinary matters, that's fine. That's also historical. As a quick historical note, really fast, in regards to this, if you go back to the Council of Constance and how the church worked with the Hussites, this is a good example of how the church has viewed people outside, which is that the church's perspective was the Hussites were a group of people that believed that they had to receive both the species of the body and blood in the sense of under both species. So they wanted to receive from the chalice in every single mass. They believed they had a right to that. And they also fell into a number of other heresies from a man named John Wycliffe. So they had fallen into a whole bunch of heresies, mainly led by demanding that they receive both. And so what the church did for a very brief period of time was to say, in that certain area, in order to solve this division, we'll allow them to receive from the chalice, that whole group of people, the Hussites. And in exchange, they came back into communion with the church and they worked it out. Now, eventually that didn't actually work out completely, and there was a crusade against these heretics, which is something actually Pope Leo condemns in one of these interviews, unfortunately, because in many times these crusades were very just and meant to preserve the unity of Christendom because of a loss of souls in Europe and throughout the world. But my point is to say that there is some precedent for saying the Bishop of Rome is going to try to offer things not in changing doctrine, but in an acceptable fashion in order to bring groups back into union with the church. So he says this. He says, he talks about the difficulties within the world of orthodoxy. He says, if the Bishop of Rome can help build bridges between different people, Moscow and Constantinople, the two main Orthodox churches, I think there's certainly challenges in that, but a great service to be offered, because ultimately we do all believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God and our Savior. And that is important. This is me talking. That is important for him to do and for us to say, because if you do hold the gospel in general is true, we believe in the New Testament, we believe even in the church of the first millennium, there are things we can do to bring these groups back into communion. And that's more possible with them than it is for pagans, for example. So there is something about that. So going back to this, he says, there's something we have to keep working on. A very concrete issue is finding a common date for Easter. That's still on the agenda. We've taken some steps. I'm not going to say we've made progress, but we've taken some steps at looking at different ways of approaching that. And he talks about the Gregorian and Julian calendar. That was my prediction at the beginning of this year, is that the church was going to make some kind of concession with the calendar. Again, the Gregorian and Julian calendar, the church has used both in history. The Orthodox will only use the Julian calendar. Some of them have even started using the Gregorian calendar, and they've split among themselves over that. But my prediction is that the Catholic Church will make some kind of concession and manage to convince some of the Orthodox to join into communion with the Catholic Church, in exchange for some kind of concession regarding the calendar. And I think that's actually somewhat likely at this point. He seems to say, well, this is actually not going anywhere at the present. It might in the future. But I still think that's something to look out for in the future. That, from my understanding, that's something within the power of the Church of Rome to do, in a similar fashion as the Church allows some Eastern Catholics to omit the filioque and the creed in their certain liturgy. I think he could also say, you follow a different calendar in exchange for you coming back into communion, in the same manner as the Church has given some concessions in the past in order to bring people back into the unity of the Church. Okay. Then they ask about Islam and the Jewish communities. He says, I may be a bit too presumptuous, but I dare say that already in the first few months, the relationship with the Jewish community has improved a bit. I think it's important to make distinctions that they themselves will make in terms of what the government of Israel is doing and who the Jewish community are. But fortunately, I think there's been, even in a couple meetings I've already had, a little bit of coming closer. I think the roots of our Christianity are found in the Jewish religion, and we cannot close our eyes to that. I think there's much to be said, much to be done. This is something I'm conflicted on with looking at Pope Leo. One, I think it's very clear that those who are saying that Pope Leo was some kind of Israeli asset that was elevated to Pope within the Catholic Church were wrong. He is very critical of the state of Israel throughout this interview, as he is here. He's making a distinction between, here is what the Jewish diaspora is doing, and here is what the government of Israel is doing. That's not even a distinction I would necessarily make, because again, they see Israel as the Jewish state, the Zionist state. And so those things really can't be separated from each other. And what I would say, and look, this has been something that popes historically have gotten wrong before the Second Vatican Council, which is saying this kind of thing. I think the roots of our Christianity are found in the Jewish religion. We cannot close our eyes to that. Okay, it was found in true Judaism back in the even before the coming of Christ. Of course, our Lord was a Jew in that sense. He was he was following the law, and he's from the Jewish nation. However, the Jewish religion of today is something completely different. As people know, it's a completely different genealogy you look at since the creation of the Babylonian Talmud, their understanding of mysticism in the Kabbalah, through their understanding of mysticism. And those things oftentimes, especially what is said in some parts of the Talmud and really the principles in the Kabbalah, are completely antithetical to Catholicism. It's something that cannot be reconciled. And it has nothing to do with the Judaism of the Old Testament. It's completely fabricated. It's something that there is no revelation there. That is something that if it did get revealed, it is revealed by demons. So it's not something that I think, it's discouraging to see the Pope say that. However, I'm not surprised, because even popes before the Second Vatican Council were deceived by that idea. I do see there as being potential here in him understanding that sort of the dangers in compromising the Catholic faith with some forms of Judaism, because again, I do think there's been positive things done, like Brant Petre's books, on the Jewish roots of the Blessed Virgin and the Jewish roots of the Eucharist. I think there's value in doing that, and I think that can actually win over a lot of Jewish converts. Showing the typological factors in the Old Testament, I think, is a really good way of bringing ethnic Jews over to Christianity. But if we're saying that their religion as it stands is compatible with Catholicism, or our roots are found in that present state of the religion, it's not true. We can't hold that to be true. And we have to be honest. If we're saying that dialogue is something we should value, that's not, we're off on a bad foot, because we're beginning dialogue with a falsehood. Okay, moving on. He talks about Islam. I've already had a couple meetings. Of course, Islam is not one reality either. So you can meet with one group and you have other groups. It's not easy. I think Francis, specifically with Islam, made great strides in overcoming some of the barriers that had existed because of his specific historical things in recent and further past. But for the good of world peace, there's no other way to go in this sense. I think that to look for ways of promoting opportunities for dialogue, mutual respect, and understanding is very, very important. Obviously, it's another issue on the agenda, and I think I would continue to hope that and not only with Islam. Now, here's something. I don't think that's entirely wrong with this idea of mutual respect and coming to the table with, let's actually understand each other's traditions seriously, and then we can have discussions with each other when you're talking about serious people. The issue is that underlying that is a hatred for God and Christianity. And that makes all dialogue impossible. If violence, trying to destroy Western civilization, is at the fundamental root of your religion, how are you going to have a dialogue with that? It's not possible. And so, again, this is a naivety on the part of the popes, especially in the post-conciliar era. But principally, when it comes to understanding Islam more and the history of the Arab world, that's something that I do think is valuable. It's valuable from the Catholic perspective. But in this sort of way of saying, like, well, there's no problem, we're just going to come together, Abraham house, that kind of thing, I think it's faulty. There were some great works back. I even have some up here. There were some great works from Western Europeans. Like this is one, the History of the Islamic Peoples by Brockelman, where it's from the West trying to understand the Arab world and Islam more. From a Catholic perspective, I think better understanding, better coming acquainted with what is going on in the Arab world, the context behind it, especially when geopolitics revolves around the region so much, and even understanding the history of their religion more, I think that can help evangelize them. And if we're saying that we're understanding them more in order to bring about better peace, a better security of the Christians in the region through mutual understanding, I think that's good. But if we're taking in this sort of let them all in, let's have an open society and destroy our own culture and we demand no respect on their part, that's the issue. And that's not something I think is addressed effectively. He talks about his meeting with the Buddhists. This is the one part I'll mention. When that mission, however, becomes distorted, the mission of ecumenism, thrown into ideologies, misunderstood, then things become more complicated. But I'm not afraid to say I believe in Jesus Christ and that he died on the cross and rose from the dead, and that we together are called to share that message. That's great. Then he says, to say that doesn't mean that I'm going to disrespect or offend or set a crusade against people of other religions, because that's just not the answer. We've learned that through history. Come on. This is that hurts. Because when somebody becomes Catholic, what is typically done if you go to RCIA? You might be a Protestant, or you might be a atheist or a non-religious person, and one of the first questions, I've been in these circles quite a while, not as much as some of our listeners certainly, but if you're trying to convert to Catholicism, a lot of people's first questions are, what about the wicked Inquisition and the Crusades? Wasn't the Catholic Church wrong in that? Now you can take two options. One is you say, we were completely wrong about everything. Well, then now all of a sudden you've made the Catholic Church out to be, it's been this evil entity for thousands of years until the Second Vatican Council, where it finally realized its sins and turned itself around. I don't think you can maintain that. The true way, and what you even see in some Novus Ordo parishes, is to say, actually, what you've been told about those things are wrong. They're black lies, and you have to just disregard them. There's a few very good books about that. I think even even like a basic work on that. The Catholic Church built Western civilization, I think it's called. It kind of goes into that. That's something they give out at RCIA sometimes, or OCIA, whatever they call it now. Even society churches, you'll see that book handed out. But to see the Pope say, yeah, those crusades were wrong. How else were the pilgrims supposed to go to the Holy Land? Who was going to protect them? This kind of like pop understanding of Catholic history that needs to get out of the papacy, get out of the curia, needs to get out of the hierarchy in general, because it does hurt. It hurts the Catholic lay faithful who are actively trying to get through, to convince the world, hey, the Catholic Church isn't all that bad, We've been trying to save people's souls, and to be betrayed by the Pope in that kind of way, going back to John Paul II, who apologized for practically everything. The best I can do to reconcile that with Catholicism is to say this is just a typical Pope trying to be liked by everybody, doesn't actually mean it and doesn't understand it. But going on, he talks about AI. Since we're a bit short for time, I'm only going to mention this some stuff here very briefly, some of the more key parts of that. He says, firstly here, to answer your question, they asked him about AI. Why is this something so important? And that's something when Pope Leo was elected, I said personally that this is going to be one of the most important parts of his pontificate. How is he dealing with AI? This is dominating all facets of life. He needs to address it. He says, if we lose sight of the value of humanity and we think that the digital world is the be-all, end-all, and then extremely rich people who are investing in artificial intelligence, totally ignoring the value of human beings and of humanity, I think the church has to speak up there. Our human life makes sense not because of artificial intelligence, but because of human beings and encounter, being with one another, creating relationships, and discovering in those human relationships also the presence of God. Here he gets close to defining what encounter means. Finding the presence of God in one another, which is actually something quite traditional. There's even patristic testimony about that. And that's all very true. I'm glad he said that. He says this, it's going to be very difficult to discover the presence of God in AI. In human relationships, we can find at least signs of the presence of God. When I speak about respect for one another and the importance of family and the values of equality and living and working together in peace, those are values that grow out of a real understanding of the wonderful gift that God gave us as human beings. If the church doesn't speak up, or if someone doesn't speak up about that, but the church certainly needs to be one of the voices here, the danger is that the digital world will go on its own ways and we will become pawns or left by the wayside. He also talks about labor. Human dignity has a very important relationship with the work that we do. Everything here is great. That's something Pope Leo needs to address. There's some people who want the Pope to only talk about, the trad issues. This is something he desperately needs to address. It's somewhat bigger than the trad issues, the AI stuff, because it's something new. It's something a part of this moment in history, and the church absolutely needs to address it as soon as possible. So I know some people are bothered by, why is he talking about this? Who cares about Chat GPT and everything? But no, this is something he absolutely needs to do quickly, is release an encyclical on artificial intelligence, address it quickly, and say, what is the relationship between artificial intelligence and human dignity and artificial intelligence and labor? That's something that the magisterium needs to speak on. And I'll also mention this. When it comes to the weakness of the Orthodox, and I will even say in some Sedevacantist circles, and look, I understand Sedevacantists have their own ways of addressing this based on the social encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII, but there is a weakness that every position has if you do not have a living authority that can address how the gospel needs to apply to artificial intelligence. And this is something that is a big strength of the Catholic Church at the moment. If the church can address artificial intelligence from the perspective of the gospel and provide an answer to it that can give the communities of the world an option on how we can actually address this properly and through the lens of the gospel. If the church manages to do that, that's going to bring honestly millions of people, I think, back to Jesus Christ. And it's a very, very big topic. And I understand it's easy to feel nihilistic about some of these more, as they say, polarizing issues, but that's a huge issue that he needs to address quickly because there's so much at stake regarding that. So I'm optimistic in that regard, looking at how he's planning to address artificial intelligence, because it does seem to be on his agenda, and that's something I would do very quickly is address that. So moving on to the third part, and things are going to get kind of quickly go a bit quicker here because some of these things just don't need a whole lot of time to address them. The third part is where he talks a lot about the abuse scandal, and I'm only going to point out a couple things. Again, this is mainly talking about the Curia Vatican finances. Let's see here. Where was that part? Which again, these are very important. I'll only mention the abuse crisis here. I think he handled this well enough. This is something very difficult. This is why I think it would be terrifying to be Pope, because the abuse crisis has killed so many souls. The recklessness, the foolishness on the part of the hierarchy in addressing the clerical abuse crisis, and sort of the glibness that even remains to this day, it's killed souls. And to have that weight on the Holy Father, I can't imagine that job. That's something I think any sensible person would be terrified of taking that job just because of the weight of this. And I think he addresses it well. He says there are some serious issues. This is one of the questions in terms of the protection of minors. The one thing I want to point out is this right here, where he talks about some priests who have been falsely accused. Let's see if there's that actual section here. This right here. Law exists, he says. Before that, he says, there have also been some proven cases of some kind of false accusation. There have been priests whose lives have been destroyed because of that. He says law exists, and we can talk about civil law or church law, but the law exists to protect the rights of all people in order to have, as much as possible, a reliable system of justice that respects the rights for all. That takes time. So one of the things that many victims do comment upon is, why do these processes take so long? Well, we live in Italy. I lived in Peru, even in the United States. Many processes that go into courts take years and years, and that's just a fact. The fact that the victim comes forward and makes an accusation, and the accusation presumably is accurate, that does not take away the presumption of innocence. So the priests have to be protected, or the accused person has to be protected. Their rights have to be respected. But even saying that at times is cause of greater pain in the victims, that's true. And the only point I want to make up here is the reason I wanted to point that out is it's significant to me that he is taking into account the priests that were falsely accused. Because even though my presumption is that the church needs to deal with the victims first, because there's been such an injustice done there. But in today's day, where we had Cardinal Pell notoriously got falsely accused, or we had many traditional leaning conservative priests that were falsely accused recently, that is a concern of mine, is these priests being able to feel safe to be priests, but at the same time protecting the victims. And Pope Leo, being a lawyer, he seems to be taking that seriously and seems to be taking some things into account there. And that was positive for me, is that he does seem to be taking the priest into account, the false accusations, but also does seem to have a very deep care for the victims. And I think his time in Peru did help with that. I think that's going to end up being a very positive thing, is his connection with the Latin American population there, which does have a unique perspective. Okay, next is another controversial one, which is talking about international relations more. And look, I don't know if some of you will agree with the Pope or myself on this topic, on some of the things here. Let's pull this up. There it is. This part they labeled as talking about Gaza, China, and the United States. So he talks about this first. This was one of the most positive parts of the interview. They ask about the specifically in Gaza, do you see that as being escalating or escalating? What space is there for dialogue? He says, that's a very difficult question, even with some pressure. I don't know how great it's been behind the scenes, but even from the United States, which is obviously the most significant third party that can place pressure on Israel in this case, pausing, that this automatically makes Pope Leo smarter than like 90% of the conservative commentariat, because they don't understand that. They don't understand that the United States has a very important role in being able to basically decide what happens in the Middle East. Some people see it as the United States is sort of bound to the Israeli government, and that, which you can say that there is a sense in which that's true, in which the entire government really has been lobbied by the Israeli foreign government or lobbying groups such as AIPAC. But there's a real sense in which if the United States got serious and said Israel needs to stop this and do this, Israel at the moment, and the window for which this can happen is closing as Israel becomes more and more independent of the United States. But there's a real sense now in which the United States government needs pressure on itself in order to stop Israel from these various tragedies occurring, from genocide being committed, starvation. He's going to talk about that in a second. But I think that's very positive that he knows the gravity of the United States' government in relation to what is going on in the Middle East. He says, even with some very clear statements being made by the United States government, recently by President Trump, there has been a clear response in terms of finding effective ways to alleviate the suffering of people. He says, it's going to be very difficult, especially with children, when people not only are deprived, but are actually starved. Just to receive food doesn't immediately solve the problem. They're going to need a lot of help, medical assistance, humanitarian aid. He says the word genocide is being thrown around more and more. Officially, the Holy See does not believe that we can make any declaration at this time about that. It would be good if they did, I'll say. It's interesting that he's viewing it in that sense. He says this, there's a very technical definition about what a genocide might be, but more and more people are raising the issue, including 2 human rights groups in Israel have made that statement. Again, that's very interesting. He sees the Holy See as being able to declare, which I don't necessarily think he thinks there's a doctrinal element to that. I think that would be beyond the Holy See's authority to say that one must dogmatically or doctrinally believe that something is or is not a genocide based on the authority of the Roman pontiff. That's very interesting. But he seems to think that's a possibility almost from this. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. He seems to at least be contemplating these questions. And again, I'm glad he's taking that into account. I do see that as being a very important role of the Holy See in the modern age. So again, I think that's very interesting, at the very least, that he's obviously taking these things into account. He understands the tragedy that affects the whole region. It affects the Israelis, but most importantly, it affects the vast amounts of people that are dying in Gaza, especially the Christians there, which he has a direct responsibility for. So going on, this is where some people might disagree with me on. He says another global player is China. This is talking about the China Accord, the deal, the Ostpolitik approach. He says, no, I would say that in the short term, I will continue the policy that the Holy See has followed for some years now, and it's been several predecessors. I in no way pretend to be wiser or more experienced than all the people that have come before me. I'm also in ongoing dialogue with a number of people, Chinese, on both sides of the issue. If you want more information on that, see our interview with the Western Confucian Journal. Now, he in general has gone through a long journey about what he particularly believes, but he gives a interesting overview on what that crisis looks like between the underground and patriotic church. One, which we'll get into a second. He says both sides that are there. I'm trying to get a clearer understanding of how the church can continue the church's mission, respecting both culture and political issues that have obviously been have great importance, while also respecting a significant group of Chinese Catholics who for many years have faced some kind of oppression or difficulty in living their faith freely without choosing sides. The Ostpolitik, the choices that have been made, say, in a realistic way, this is what we can do right now, moving towards the future. I'm certainly taking that into consideration, dealing with the Chinese people in government as well as religious people and lay people. It's a very difficult situation in the long term. I don't pretend to say this is what I will and will not do, but after 2 months, I've already begun having discussions at several levels on that topic. So there's been a lot of traditionalists who have been bringing up a point that happened recently, which was the Holy See recognized basically a agreement and is moving forward with an agreement to make sure that the Chinese Patriotic Church its boundaries are kept in place in certain areas of China, while the underground church gets some of its bishops not persecuted and gets an official position there, while it's still under the technical administration of the Patriotic Church. The traditionalist perspective, very strangely, I'll say, has taken the approach that the underground church in China is 100% in the right, and that it needs the support, and that if the Holy See recognizes in any way the Patriotic Church, which is the church that is typically affiliated with the Chinese government rather than not being affiliated with the Chinese government, that if they recognize the Patriotic Church, that is a betrayal of the underground church. If you watch our interview with Western Confucian Journal, you'll realize that that's very strange for traditionalists to say, and it doesn't entirely work out. Why? Well, because of a few reasons. The Chinese Patriotic Church was persecuted by the Chinese government as well as the underground church. It was not as simple as one church is the communist church, one is not. They were both persecuted because they were both Catholic. The other weird thing is that the Chinese Patriotic Church, up until the 1990s, was using exclusively the traditional Latin Mass. A lot of people don't know that. The underground church was characterized by the liturgical reform and promoting democracy and even liberalism, because it was associated with the Hong Kong movement and some of the more dissident forces within China. So it's actually more complicated than people make it out to be. What I support, and what I think the Holy See supports on some level, I'll make one more mention. There is some speculation that, and I think with good reason, that the Holy See has, due to receiving payouts from China, the Chinese government, has betrayed the underground church in some way and given more leverage to the above ground church, the Patriotic Church. And there's probably something to that. People have brought up Cardinal McCarrick's involvement in that. I don't doubt that there is some sort of payout or corruption that is involved with all of that. But I think on the surface, Pope Benedict's explanation of wanting there to be a sort of détente, an agreement between the underground and Patriotic Church, a coming together through certain practical agreements, I don't think it's out of the question, especially when you look in the history of the Catholic Church, giving certain governments some authority over what goes on in their local church. Goodness, even the Holy Roman Emperor had a veto over who became Pope. That's in the 20th century. So it's not out of the question for the Chinese government to have some involvement in picking bishops. We're going to have to be careful because communists are snakes, but it's not out of the question for them to be picking bishops or having some involvement. I don't want to say necessarily picking the bishop and setting up their parallel church. That would be out of the question. But this is more complicated than people realize. And I think what some people do is they do a surface level reading of the situation. They read various statements that are made by intelligence agencies like the CIA, and they will simply say, what the CIA has said about the Chinese government is completely true. Which, if you're in any kind of like conservative or right-wing circle, if you listen to Tucker Carlson or any people like this, you would know that's crazy. You can't just take what the neoliberal or neoconservative United States government says about the Chinese government on the surface, because we have to realize that there's a liberal perspective, which is anti-Catholic, and there's a communist perspective, which is also anti-Catholic. So this is not a simple question of the underground church is a whole bunch of traditionalists who hate Vatican II and love the traditional Latin Mass. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. And Cardinal Zen's perspective needs to be respected. It needs to be heard out. We need to know what the underground church is asking for. But the Patriotic Church also needs its perspective. Those who want to receive the sacraments, and their only option is to receive it in the Patriotic Church, and they're living in an otherwise pagan communist culture, they absolutely need to have their perspective heard as well. It's not as simple as what people are telling you in that regard. So again, I'd recommend listening to the Western Confucian Journal on that. You can be more skeptical than he is regarding the Chinese government. I'm much more skeptical of that in that regard as well. So I know that's a big tangent there, but I think that's something very important because I'm not entirely supportive of the way that some conservative and traditionalist forces have looked at that perspective, especially considering that the same people that are often saying the church has betrayed the underground church are ones saying the Novus Ordo Mass is evil, when actually in reality, Cardinal Zen was the one that introduced the Novus Ordo into China. The underground church did that, not the patriotic church. A lot of information there. Go watch that interview if you're interested. You can also see an alternative perspective with somebody who's more in line with the typical United States American perspective, which is Stephen Mosier. We did an interview with him here on the channel as well. Okay, moving on from that. There's a lot there. He talks about some of the going into partisan politics. The only thing I will say here is that he does seem to have a very similar perspective to Pope Francis regarding immigration, concerning, I'll say. For example, they've asked him about Donald Trump. And well, I'll move back for a second. He talked about that conversation he had with J.D. Vance. He did have a conversation with J.D. Vance. If you go back, there was a famous thing where J.D. Vance refused to, more of a notorious thing, I should say, where J.D. Vance refused to kiss Pope Leo's ring. That I disagreed with that choice. But then he had a conversation with Pope Leo, and he says this is what he told J.D. Vance. I talked about human dignity and how important that is for all people wherever you're born, and hopefully to find ways to respect human beings and the way we treat them and the policies and choices we make. Now, look, and he says, there are some things in the States that are of a concern, obviously. Look, I agree that everyone needs to be treated in a dignified manner, respecting one's duties of wanting to come into union with God. And we should respect everyone's human rights that are fundamental to them, which are actually stemming from those duties to God and to our neighbor. But when we're talking about a country being able to respect its borders, this is a lot more simple than being like, hokey pokey. Actually, what we're doing is everything's fine. Let everybody in, treat everybody kind. We'll hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Because when you're talking about criminals, bloody, murderous people coming into the country, people who don't respect the laws of the country coming in, people who hate Western civilization coming in the case of Europe, people from a completely different foreign culture, foreign religion coming in, that is different. Yes, people need to have their human dignity respected. I think the Trump administration, in regards to immigration, has actually done that. You can point to some incidents where I think you might have to raise some questions, but it's concerning that he sees that as being the concerning factor there, because I think there's actually a whole lot more that's concerning within the Trump administration, and the immigration question is not one of them. It's actually more respectful of human dignity to care about these things in the way of wanting to limit illegal immigration, especially since Catholics are supposed to follow the law. If it's a legitimate law, it's a legitimate authority. You end up encouraging illegal migration and not following the law if you say you can't deport an individual, or it should be, you need open borders. So that's concerning. You have this kind of strange thing where, I'll just read this. He says, President Trump made a statement last week about how he didn't have it on his agenda to want to meet with me, and then said, but his brother's a nice guy, and that's fine. One of my brothers has met him, and that's been been very outspoken about his political viewpoints. But if or when there were specific issues that if it were possible to engage with him, I would have no problem doing so. I think there are others who are doing that role just fine, and he makes his choices, who he listens to and who he doesn't want to listen to. So something he talks about, and before that, he also says, he references the letter of Pope Francis, the talk of Pope Francis regarding the treatment of immigrants. And he also speaks about it being more appropriate for the church within the United States to engage President Trump. This is not the end of the world. Sky is falling part here, because I'll just say this. I do think it's appropriate for the United States bishops to deal with with President Trump. That's the principle of subsidiarity, I think, kind of applies there, where you've got something on the lowest level that can deal with it, doesn't need to go straight to the top right away. You can have the United States bishops speak with Trump and work with Trump on these sorts of things. It's interesting that he references his brother. He doesn't seem to hate his brother, who is a big MAGA supporter. I don't think Pope Leo is going to be much of a political activist in regards to Trump. He seems to have a sense of gravity that he doesn't want the Holy See getting involved in political issues, which I do think is more positive than what Pope Francis was, who I do think tended towards being a political activist. Now, there is one more, there's two more. One is the fifth part, which is specifically about polarization in the world. I'm going to skip that part because he has one interesting mention of talking about ideology, something that we don't want the gospel to be transformed by ideology. I'll say the same thing I said about polarization. There needs to be a definition of what exactly is the problem with ideology, because you could, in the sense I think much of the hierarchy understands ideology as, you can apply that to Catholicism, right? ISM. They'll say we don't want any more isms. Well, ideology is in everyone. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson has come out and in his second book, or actually third book, he mentioned that ideology is toxic for the human individual, and that you don't want to be taken over by it. But ideology, I really do think, is essential to how the human brain works and how the human soul functions in a human society, because you need an organizing structure, an organizing principle in order to operate within a society. And ideology is necessary in order to do that. So I would like to see, what do you mean by ideology? That's, again, a buzzword that I think he's sort of adopted because Pope Francis said that. But, Pope Leo, you're an Augustinian. You can be more precise in these terms. Let's define them. He said that ideology is making us use the gospel for this or that. But what are we meaning by ideology? Because in many ways, I think many of the definitions can simply be interpreted as Catholicism as an ideology. That needs to be defined. Okay, last part of this is the most controversial, which is where he talks about the traditional Latin Mass and the LGBT issues, which is of course, for the traditionalists, that's going to be the most important two issues. I think most people are looking at that. So this is the last part here. We're going to really dissect this whole thing. It's shorter. The interviewer asked, two of the most prominent hot button issues that came out of the synod on synodality in terms of the debate they generated were the role of women in the church and the church's approach to the LGBT plus community. What were your thoughts on the discussion about these two issues, and how will you approach them in your new role as Pope? He says, in a synodal way, for most people, certainly the understanding that the role of women in the church has to continue to develop. I think in that sense, there was a positive response. I hope to continue in the footsteps of Francis, including in appointing women to some leadership roles at different levels in the church's life, recognizing the gifts that women have that can contribute to the life of the church in many ways. One thing, pausing there, that I think the Catholic Church has to be very careful about is making it so that, you'll hear this a lot in traditional Catholic circles, which is complementarianism, which is that men and women have different gifts that complement one another, and that there are different roles that are fit with those different gifts that are more specific to one sex or the other. One issue that we have to be careful of, especially in this political time where the church wants to involve women in everything and involve try to get the modern world to be more in line, try to get the church to be more in line with the modern world, and thereby be feminist, is that we don't want to make it seem like the reason that Jesus Christ made it so that men can only be the ones that receive ordination is arbitrary. I heard an interview with Allie Beth Stuckey. She's a Calvinist, and she said that, and she had a very confused thing she said, where she said, I could be a pastor. I could be a very good pastor. I could be the best pastor in the world, be better than any of these people. But I'm a woman, and I have to arbitrarily respond to what these rules are about women, because that's what God said. I think we have to be more careful about that. And I worry that Pope Leo's statements regarding the difference of the sexes comes down to that there's an arbitrary distinction between men and women regarding their gifts, when I think in reality, men and women have, based on their biology, based on the way their souls are designed, they have different roles that are more fitting to their nature, to the essential properties that are their part of their gender, their sex. And that's something I wish we could see more of, because once Pope Leo starts saying this, like, okay, well, the entire Vatican Curia, the entire court of the Vatican, could be entirely operated by women. This is the case for, in my diocese, the Diocese of Phoenix. If you look at the staff for the diocese, it's all women. There's not a single man. But when you look at the priests, it's, of course, all men, and the bishop is a man. But does that make sense? That makes it seem like it's just completely arbitrary. And I don't we're talking about dialogue and helping people to understand doctrine more. I don't think that's actually helping anybody. I think it would be better to say, how did God design us to be? And what is the plan for our salvation? And how do the essential properties of what makes us us, how does that relate to the plan for our salvation? Rather than saying this is an arbitrary code that God has imposed on everybody, and it doesn't make any sense, but men can be ordained because they can be ordained. I think it's more than that. I think God is a masterful artist, and it comes more down to how he made us and how we are designed to do certain things. So he goes on to say, and so he jumps right into this ordination question. He says, the topic becomes a hot button issue when the specific question is about ordination. What the Synod has spoken about specifically was the ordination, perhaps, of women deacons, which has been a question that has been studied for many years now. And every time the commission has said it's impossible, can't be done. There have been different commissions, he says, appointed by different popes to say, what can we do about this? Pausing there, I see that as such a problem in the church that it sees doctrine less as like God's design for our lives and more like, how can we get around this? How can we get around and skirt the line about what is allowed and not allowed in the church? That's tempting God. That's tempting him. And it's I think, antithetical to the gospel. If we're talking about the gospel, as Pope Leo talks about, that's one of them, is kind of avoiding that skirting around the law, looking more to the spirit of the law. He says this, I think this will continue to be an issue. I, at the moment, don't have an intention of changing the church teaching on the topic. I think there are some previous questions that have to be asked. Now, some people have taken a big issue with this. I, at the moment, don't have an intention of changing the teaching of the church on the topic. And when I saw that at first, I freaked out. Because what is the implication? The implication is that you could change the church teaching on the topic in the future. Now, there have been a few people. I'll mention Father Peter Totalbin, who's a traditionalist conservative. He's kind of an eclectic personality. He's raised some points about this, and classical theist, who I respect immensely as well, he's also raised his own points, which is that I don't actually think, in the context of everything here, this is as dramatic as people are saying. I tend to see Pope Leo just saying here, he's not changing the church teaching on the topic. I do think he's confused, though, and this is where I might separate from some of the defenders of Pope Leo, wanting defend every single thing he says. I think he's confused because I don't think he has a complete understanding of how. And this is just the paradox of them. As I said, the episcopate is low information. They don't understand everything in regards to Catholic doctrine. And so I think he's under the understanding the female deacons, we're not talking about priests, by the way, but I think he's understanding the female deacons is a doctrine in the church that isn't infallible, but it's still binding, which is a characteristic within the Catholic Church. Some some teachings of the church that are undefinitive, not definitive in nature, actually do bind you, but they're not infallible. They could change in the future. So, now, of course, things like that are relating to natural law, they've been infallibly defined, or an ecumenical council has spoken on it. That, that's out of the question. You can't change that. But in this, so where my disagreement would be, and where I think Pope Leo is a bit confused, is that I think he's under the impression that the female deacons, some people have said this is talking about female priests. It's very clear in the context he's not talking about female priests. He's under the impression that the female deaconess thing is of a non-definitive nature and could change in the future, but it's still binding on us that they can't be made deacons. I would say it is definitive in nature. It can't change in the future. And I don't think the church will change the topic. And he says he's not going to. He's not going to try. So even if he is confused on that, it's not going to be relevant in his pontificate. So that's my take on that. It's confusing. It's disappointing that he's low information on that, as I think most of the episcopate are. I don't think most of the bishops have any understanding of how of Catholic doctrine works. And I know that's, presumptuous for me to say, but I'm very confident in that. I've spoken to quite a few bishops, and I think even they would recognize they didn't receive a very good seminary formation, and they were appointed more for their administrative roles and their administrative gifts rather than their understanding of doctrine. And they don't have people around them that could help with that either, because the seminary formation is so poor. Okay, he says this. One small example. I'll skip over that. He talks about the diaconate not having a proper understanding of being the ones who catechize. And he says this. He says, why would we talk about ordaining women to the diaconate if the diaconate itself is not yet properly understood and properly developed and promoted within the church? And what are the reasons for that? So while I think there are significant inspiration at the time of the council when the permanent diaconate was in effect reinstated, it has not become in many parts of the world what I think some people thought it would be earlier on. So I think there are some questions that have to be asked around that issue. For those who don't know, if you go to traditionalist communities like the Society of St. Pius X, you see this also in the Fraternity of St. Peter and ICKSP, there is no permanent deacons. Now, in some cases, especially in the Fraternity and the Institute, you'll see that sometimes. There are some permanent deacons. But the society, the only time you'll see a deacon is when they're 1 year before being made a priest in the seminary. It's the last stage. And that is the more traditional way of doing that. The Second Vatican Council made it so that you have a whole bunch of married deacons helping the parish. And I will agree with Pope Leo. If you go to your, average parish, I don't actually think many people have any understanding of what these men are supposed to be doing. They're there for some of the masses, but many times they're not doing a priestly role. And I think an error in the West, especially, is that this is something that retired guys do to have some kind of prestige in their life and be respected in the parish, which is an error. That's obviously not something that's good or fruitful. If it was a role that I think you had men who are called to marriage, who want to live out the marital life, but at the same time want some kind of catechetical role, that would be one thing. But the church hasn't done that, and so it's irrelevant. And so I actually think Pope Leo is right here that if that is a project they want to take on, they shouldn't. I don't think. It's a waste of time. We have bigger problems. But if they wanted to take on that problem, they have to figure out what exactly a deacon is supposed to do before figuring out any of the questions about the female diaconate, even though I would say it's impossible. A female deacon is a contradiction in terms in that sense of being an ordained deacon. Okay. He talks about clericalism. It's not worth talking about right now. Okay, now for the LGBT point. He said, just to follow up on the LGBT point, it can be a very ideological issue. What will your approach be? He says, well, I don't have a plan at the moment. I was asked about that already a couple times during the first couple of months about the LGBT issue. I recall something that a cardinal from the eastern part of the world said to me before I was pope about, quote, the Western world is fixated, obsessed with sexuality, end quote. A person's identity for some people is all about sexual identity. And for many people in other parts of the world, that's not a primary issue in terms of how we should deal with one another. I confess that's on the back of my mind because, as we've seen at the Synod, as any issue dealing with the LGBT questions is highly polarizing within the church. For now, because what I've already tried to demonstrate and live out in terms of my understanding of being Pope at this time in history, I'm not trying to continue to polarize or promote polarization in the church. What I'm trying to say is what Pope Francis said very clearly: todos, todos, todos. Everybody's invited in. But I don't invite a person in because they are or not of a specific identity. Pausing there. Well, if your identity is antithetical to what a Catholic is, if you're not living out a Catholic life and you're doing so publicly, well, you're excluding yourself. And it's one thing to say, I'm struggling with something, I'm having a hard time with this, help me. And then it's another thing to say, I'm not struggling with this. This is a key part of what my identity is, even though it's a sin, and accept me for who I am. And I'm not even going to confess these things because it's good, as we saw with the LGBT pilgrimage recently. Those people were not, ashes and hair shirts coming saying we want to overcome our inclinations, overcome our passions, and be united in theosis and uniting ourselves with God and overcome our sins. They were saying, accept us for who we are. And does Pope Leo get that? No, I wouldn't say. I hope not. I hope he doesn't get it, because if he does get it, this would imply that he's sort of skirting around the issue, that he doesn't want to rock the boat. I don't think that's out of the question. I think he could be doing that. He says, you're all welcome, and let's get to know one another and respect one another. At some point, when specific questions come up, people want the church doctrine to change, want attitudes to change. This is the controversial point that everybody has found an issue with. I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any given question. I saw some people, this is me saying, I'll finish this quote. He says, I find it highly unlikely, certainly in the near future, the church's doctrine in terms of what the church teaches about sexuality, what the church teaches about marriage, will change. Okay. Here's what I think about this. This is complicated. It shouldn't be. Should be very easy to address, but he has answered this in an ambiguous way. When I first saw this, as I think most traditionalists did, I saw this as, well, we need to sort of convince everybody that we need to change minds about making people less homophobic, and then we can make gay marriage doctrinal. That's how I read it. I've since realized that's not a clear reading. That's not evident in the text. What is evident here is that, and what I think kind of goes with his perspective, and this is still not good, but it's different than that, and how some people have immediately said that is the only reading you can have on that. I think what he's saying is, let's try to convince people that the current church teaching is true before we get wrapped up in saying, let's change the church teaching. I think that's his idea of we have to change attitudes before we think about changing what the church says about any given question. So that's what he says there. Now, he goes on to say, I find it highly unlikely that the church will change about sexuality and what the church teaches about marriage. Look, it can't change on those essential matters. I think a charitable reading is that he thinks this is something interesting to think about. He probably sees at the moment church teaching as being amoris laetitia and fiducia supplicans. Keep that in mind. So I just see it as he sees this as being a polarizing issue. He's not going to touch it, which is better than having an activist, but it's not what we'd really want in that regard. And I've seen some people say, this is disappointing. Why didn't we see Pope Leo come out and condemn the LGBT movement? Well, just because he's not that guy. He's not that Pius XIII. But I don't think he's going to rock the boat. Now, this was interesting. He said he did condemn the groups that were blessing gay couples, which is interesting. It's very interesting since he just met with a guy who did exactly what he condemns here, Father James Martin. I've already spoken about marriage, he says, as Pope Francis did with since he was Pope, about a family being a man and a woman in solemn commitment, blessed in the sacrament of marriage. But even to say that, I understand some people will take it that badly. It will take that badly. So notice he does very much so care about what other people think. Most traditionalists, I think, are temperamentally not of that variety. And so they wouldn't understand that. Many people are just like, we're beyond that. But that obviously is what he cares about. He doesn't want to rock the boat with those who are promoting that. In Northern Europe, they're already publishing rituals of blessing people who one another is the way they express it, which specifically goes against the document that Pope Francis approved, Fiducia Supplicans, which basically says, of course we can bless all people, but it doesn't look for a way of ritualizing some kind of blessing, because that's not what the church teaches. That doesn't mean that those people are bad people, but I think it's very important, again, to understand how to accept others who are different than we are, how to accept people who make choices in their life, and to respect them. That's confusing. I just don't think he's really thought about this a whole lot, if you want to know the truth, because they seem to kind of contradict one another. Okay, if we're saying we have to accept others who are different than we are, as if it's sort of, this, how many freckles does somebody have? That's one thing. But if you're saying this person has made their identity into being one of the sins that cries out for vengeance, that's obviously very different. And if you're saying, well, you can't bless this, well, Pope Francis seemed to have interpreted that differently, and the bishops seem to have interpreted that differently. And so what needs to be done is he needs to clarify it in an official document, because this certainly doesn't do that, doesn't clarify anything. He does say this: I do understand this is a very hot button topic, that some people will make demands. We want the recognition of gay marriage, for example, or we want recognition of people who are trans. To say this is officially recognized and approved by the church, the individuals will be accepted and received. What does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. Does that mean the person will be hearing a confession? Maybe. Does that mean the person is going to live in a parish life in his certain sinful identity? Who knows? He says this, though: any priest who has ever heard confessions will have heard confessions from all kinds of people and all kinds of issues. Okay. Now he does go on to, he does he's insistent in the fact that a marriage is between a man and a woman, and how that's very important. For example, he says, I think that the role of the family in society, the family is father, mother, and children. That's very strong. And he says families need to be supported, what they call the traditional family. And says that's the family. If we take away the basic building block, it becomes very difficult to learn that in other ways. So, that's very good that he's insisting on that. But as I've said before, we have to avoid this sort of allowing two contradictory notions within the church and then trying to reconcile them. Okay, we support the traditional family, but we want to also accept those who have made sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance their identity. Those things don't mesh, and it has to be more clear from the Holy Father. And we can hope that he'll come out with that. I'm not optimistic he'll speak about that much at all, actually. I think he's going to try to avoid it, because I think he sees it as polarizing. Now, this is what people have been talking about a lot. To Crux's credit, I don't really agree with how they conducted this interview, but they did talk about the traditional Latin Mass. He says this. They ask, regarding the study group on the liturgy, what is being studied? How much of the reason for establishing this was related to divisions surrounding the traditional Latin Mass? I want to read this entirely. He says, my understanding of what the group came out with is primarily from issues that have to do with the enculturation of the liturgy, how to continue the process of making the liturgy more meaningful with a different culture, within a specific culture, and a specific place at a given time. I think that was the primary issue. He says this now. There's another issue, which is also another hot button issue, which I've already received a number of requests and letters about. That's interesting. He actually received them. For many times, you remember the Pope splainers back in Pope Francis' time were saying he just hasn't received the requests about the traditional Latin Mass. Obviously we know the Pope does receive requests. He says this now. The question about people always say the Latin Mass. Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem. Obviously, between the Tridentine Mass and the Vatican II Mass, the Mass of Paul VI, I'm not sure where that's going to go. It's obviously very complicated. So this is me talking now. I think it's clear now that Pope Leo just is not educated about this issue. Nobody's big problem, as Archbishop Lefebvre said continuously, I think it was in They Have Uncrowned Him, an open letter to confuse Catholics, Bishop Speaks. He frequently said, the Latin it's important, and the society will say continuously, and they say this in their seminaries, that Latin is a very important thing to have in the church. The Second Vatican Council says that. And Pope Leo says that even. Pope Leo has spoken in Latin many times. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the Mass was butchered, that a new rite was fabricated in a matter of few years, even disregarded a lot of the work of the liturgical reform that came before it. And it has a completely different structure, and it's lost its essential structure of what made the Roman Rite the Roman Rite. A good book on that, maybe I have it here. Let's see. I do. Is right here. Dr. Kwasniewski's The Once and Future Roman Rite. I'm not claiming this is some major academic treatise. It's a good place to start in understanding the liturgical debate, because this book right here shows that the new Mass, what Pope Leo calls the Mass of Paul VI, really doesn't match up to what the characteristics of what makes the Roman Rite is. And that the history is extremely it's more complicated than people like this, that people like who I think are informing Pope Leo's perspective, what they're saying. And so I wish Pope Leo could sit down with somebody who actually says, we have problems with what the liturgical reform did. And here they are. Here are the problems with the new Mass. And here is why we like the old Mass, not because of aesthetics or because it's in Latin, because if it was, I highly doubt Archbishop Lefebvre would have done anything he did if the only change was making the Mass in English, and maybe the canon was in Latin, and made it so that a sermon was necessary at every Mass. I highly doubt it. I think Archbishop Lefebvre said things very similar to that effect. But creating a new rite that's completely different than the Roman Rite, that's the problem. And it's not been answered sufficiently. There's been no dialogue about that topic. Very little. It was just basically misinformed people in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s talking to the Society of St. Pius X, uninformed about what was going on. We saw some progress with Summorum Pontificum that allowed the Latin Mass to be said by any priest, but it didn't solve the root problem. Now he says this now, I do know that part of the issue, unfortunately, has become, again, part of the process of polarization. People have used the liturgy as an excuse for advancing other topics. It's become a political tool, and that's very unfortunate. I really dislike that, because notice that he didn't talk about that in regards to the LGBT issue. Is that not a political tool? Obviously that is. What political factor is being used in the traditional Latin Mass? Many people who go to the traditional Latin Mass are critical of the Trump administration. Many people who go to the traditional Latin Mass are in Africa. They're in Asia. I know, you can look through every continent. They're going to the traditional Latin Mass. So what political thing is being advocated? I just simply don't get it. Maybe he's using political in a loose sense, but I don't think he's being consistent there. Well, really, it's not him speaking. It's other people who have told him this, and he's parroting it. I don't think he's actually spoken to anybody who knows about this topic. Now he says this, I think sometimes to say abuse of the liturgy from what we call the Vatican II Mass was not helpful for people who are looking for a deeper experience of prayer, of contact with the mystery of faith that they seem to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. If I had to guess, he might have gotten that from maybe conversations he's had with Archbishop Corleone or similar people who say things very similar to that. Very much in line with what people like that would say. But I'll point out, when people talk about abuse of the Novus Ordo, they mean a billion different things. Some people mean, when they talk about the abuse of the Novus Ordo, and well, it'll make more sense if I finish this paragraph. He says, again, we've become polarized. Instead of being able to say, if we celebrate the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do we really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? So what he's saying is this. He's saying that if, really what the problem is people have made this into a political tool. They've riled people up. And that if we just said the Novus Ordo properly, people would say, oh, well, this is not even different than the traditional Mass. But that's always been again, if you just read this book, he would get it. He would understand, oh, there's more to this. If you understood what Archbishop Lefebvre was saying, he would get it. If you even read that little book that the society puts out, The Problem with the Liturgical Reform, I think somebody would understand this. But as I was saying, when we speak of the abuse of the Novus Ordo, people mean that in a billion different ways. Some people mean that to mean it's facing the people. That's an abuse. It should be ad orientem. Ratzinger sometimes said that. He said that the Christian liturgy, what makes it essentially Christian, is facing ad orientem, facing east. So is that an abuse? Well, Pope Leo says Mass facing the people almost always. So is he celebrating Mass in an abusive way? Some people mean communion on the hand. That's an abuse. Well, that happens at every Vatican Mass. Some people mean it in the sense that you have too many extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. Well, that happens all the time. Some people mean it there's no altar rails. Some people mean that the music is irreverent. What are we talking about? Nobody knows. And this is the problem with the Novus Ordo in and of itself, is that there is not a Novus Ordo. There is no new rite. There might be the book, but each priest interprets it differently, that de facto, from the fact, there is not a new Mass. There's a billion different new Masses because each priest celebrates it differently. There's 4 different canons. They say the canons differently. Many priests ad-lib the canon. I've seen that. They ad-lib the canon and face no repercussions from their bishop. So what is the new Mass? Okay, so maybe you say that is an abuse. But what the traditional movement has always said is that even things like receiving communion on the hand, not having altar rails, things essential to the 22nd session of the Council of Trent, that the Council of Trent has said these things, and we've talked about this in various articles, these are the things that make the traditional Mass. You can't criticize these certain things. Saying the canon out loud, the Council of Trent specifically says you are anathema if you say the canon needs to be said out loud. It can't be said silently. There's an anathema attached to it, one of the canons. So, and attached to the explanations attached to the canons. That gets into the weeds a little bit. But my point is only to say that abuse can mean a billion different things to a billion different people. And it seems that Pope Leo only has like a very pop understanding of this and doesn't really understand what the traditional critiques are, which comes down to the text of the Novus Ordo Mass, not just how it is celebrated, which is different varying place to place. And the vast majority, most traditionalists would say, is an abuse of the Novus Ordo. Last thing, St. John Cantius's way of saying the Novus Ordo is what the Novus Ordo looks like in its proper way, then the Novus Ordo is not celebrated properly almost every time, because St. John Cantius says it in a way that is, and you can look at some of the Brompton Oratory, these famous places that try to make the Novus Ordo look like the Latin Mass. Very rare. The traditional Latin Mass is much more prevalent than how that looks. And so we have a much bigger problem on our hands if that's how the Novus Ordo needs to look and there's an abuse. That means that liturgical abuse is so widespread that it's such a monumental problem, and you end up in a crisis in the church in the same position that the society says we're in, which at that point, why not just go back to the traditional Mass and fix the problem? That's my spiel on that. Last paragraph. Okay, he says, I have not had the chance to really sit down with a group of people who are advocating for the Tridentine Rite. There's an opportunity coming up soon, and I'm sure there will be occasions for that. But that is an issue that I think also, maybe with synodality, we have to sit down and talk about. That's positive, me speaking now. That's very good. I'm glad he said that. And I'll finish this. He says, it's become the kind of issue that's so polarized that people aren't willing to listen to one another. Oftentimes I've heard bishops talk to me. They've talked to me about that, where they say, we invited them to this and that, and they just won't hear it. They don't even want to talk about it. That's a problem in itself. It means we're into ideology now. We're no longer into the experience of church communion. That's one of the issues on the agenda. There's 3 things I want to break down here. First is this strange kind of a mysterious mention of there's an opportunity coming up soon. So that's probably referring to two things. One is the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, which we covered, where Cardinal Burke is going to be able to say the Tridentine Mass in the Vatican for the first time, really, since the traditional Latin Mass had more restrictions put on it. I imagine Cardinal Burke has been alluding to how he's going to go about that, which is he's obviously gearing up for a sort of political maneuver to speak with Pope Leo about saying, look, we have the Tridentine Mass is not political. We just like the beauty of it. And I have my own issues with that because, again, I don't think that does justice to the traditional Mass's critiques. It might work. It might get Pope Leo to bring us back at least to where we were before Summorum Pontificum, where maybe you have more access to the Tridentine Mass than we do now. The other thing he might be mentioning is a meeting with the Society of St. Pius X, which I imagine the meeting about the bishops will happen probably before the end of the year. I don't have any private information on that, by the way. That's not, I can't claim that I've been told that by anybody. That's my speculation, but I imagine that's going to happen soon. And that would be an opportunity. And I think the society would be much better in talking and advocating for the Society of St. Pius X than even Cardinal Burke would. And, if the society is diplomatic about it, which I think they are, these are very smart people. Menzingen, the headquarters for the society, for all of its, organizational difficulty it's faced in the past, there's some very smart priests there. And as I've said in the past, I actually trust them to be the advocates for the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Mass, I should just say, the Roman Rite with the Holy Father. So I think that's coming up soon. He's probably alluding to both there. The other thing he is saying is that, again, we need to sit down and talk about it. I completely agree. Pope Leo has a lot of learning to do about both perspectives, both the liturgical reform and the pro-Tridentine side, the pro-traditional Latin Mass. And, I just don't think that's been done. This is something kind of strange, he says, this anecdote about the bishops inviting them, ambiguous pronoun, to this, and that they won't even hear it. I imagine that's referring to one of two things. One, it could be a traditional bishop or a cardinal has complained to Pope Leo asking about, or a priest even, has complained to Pope Leo about not being allowed to say the Tridentine Mass in the traditional Roman Rite in various dioceses. And the bishop has just said, no, we're not going to hear it. Traditionis Custodes says no. Maybe the Fraternity of St. Peter has had contact with him. And this is, again, just pure speculation on my part, and said, we faced this issue over and over again. What can be done about that? That could be what he's referring to. What worries me, and what I speculate might also be at play here, is that there could also have been another more liberal bishop who has said, we've asked the Fraternity of St. Peter to come say the Chrism Mass, and they won't hear it. That could be another issue. But I would just say, it's one side of that is there's obviously a power imbalance. Because if you're telling a priest, for example, why would a traditional priest want to hear, or what would he have to benefit if the bishop is just saying, you are going to celebrate the new Mass and we're going to send you to a re-education camp, as they did in the United States, literally, re-education camps, psychological warfare camps to get these priests to stop saying the traditional Mass. I think Father Z has some good articles on that. So, that's not dialogue. Obviously, the priest isn't going to want to hear that. If the priest is saying, this is essential to my flock and myself, our spirituality, what benefit is the priest going to have from hearing out, stop that, no liturgy for you, enculturation is for the Amazonians, not for you freaks. That's not fair. It's another thing altogether for the opposite side. The bishop needs to hear out the needs of the needs of the faithful when they say, we want what has been holy for all times, especially when there's precedent even 2 popes ago with Pope Benedict XVI. So, he mentions here it's one of the things on the agenda, so we could see something pop up in the future about that. Again, I'm not optimistic it's going to happen in the first few years of his pontificate. I think we'll probably see the Society of St. Pius X bishop conversation happen by the end of this year, and that's probably going to continue for a long period of time. And, we'll have to see how everything plays itself out. We'll probably see with that Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, some things develop. All right, concluding thoughts, very briefly here. As I think we've laid out, I don't think the sky is falling. There's nothing really surprising in this. Everything here, I think Sarah Vervey and I could have predicted, Brian McCall and I could have predicted back before this Pope was elected and right after the Pope was elected. This is very much to have been expected. If somebody was expecting a Pius XIII character, of course you're going to be disappointed. If somebody was expecting Francis II, you might find yourself finding some things here that are more optimistic than pessimistic. I think the balanced reality here is that this is a Pope who doesn't want to rock the boat, who sees himself as a unifying figure, and does want some conversation to start taking place. I do think it's very important for the traditional Catholic movement to be more organized, which we have very good priests on this front, and the traditional movement has always been good about being professional and organized. This is, as we talked about during the Roman Forum, the traditional movement has almost always been a lay dominant movement, which is kind of strange. It's often accused as being clericalist. You've had lay people at the front here. But I think it is important for the academic side of the traditional movement to say, let's get serious and let's talk. And I actually think there could be some fruit that's developed there. But if anybody is under the delusion that things are completely different, that this is a complete reverse to the preconciliar times, we're just simply not there, and that's unrealistic. We have to be very realistic in understanding this is not a black and white situation. And also an understanding that the episcopate has, as I've said, low information, barely understands anything about how church doctrine works, and that really they're more focused on the pastoral side of things and not wanting to rock the boat with the faithful in the modern world. And if we come into these conversations understanding that, while also getting leverage on our part by establishing good and faithful communities with good priests being able to guide us, where we're not afraid of our masses getting shut down, which is again why I think society communities offer such a great thing to lay people, and why I also think some, even the so-called indult communities, the fraternity and the institute, these kinds of places that are kind of set in stone, I think they offer a lot. People need to get themselves in safe environments where they're confident their environment's not going to be shut down. And then once we have some sort of leverage where we're confident the community is not going to get shut down, then we can have these sort of back and forth dialogues, which is a loaded term, and maybe see some sort of restoration in regards to the traditional doctrine of the church. Last prediction, as I've said, and as I think this interview has made very clear, I imagine what this pontificate is going to look like is a lot of focus on artificial intelligence, on workers' rights and rights of the poor. It's going to leave the controversial issues aside, and you're going to see less of a focus on the sort of Francis-esque way of facing international relations. Pope Leo seems to want to be transformative in that regard. So it's very interesting. I do wish there were some more follow-up questions in this interview. I think that would have been interesting. But let us know what you think in the comments below. If you have a disagreement with maybe an interpretation here, we want to hear it. Because again, this is something that I think there does need to be a conversation around, so that the traditional movement is thinking about these things and is able to, we have to grow an understanding of our own faith, because that's, we develop fruit in that in our own meditation. We develop fruit in that in growing closer to understanding Jesus Christ, so that we can grow in knowledge and therefore grow in love of God. And so I think these conversations, if we keep them civil, if we keep them if we keep them with proper understandings of things and growing in charity, I think fruitful conversation can definitely happen as a result from considering these issues. So thank you so much for watching us today. If you want to go read more articles about these sorts of things, we have a lot of it over on catholicfamilynews.locals.com, where you can get the e-edition of the paper, the October edition of the paper. We've got a lot in that paper. You can also go to our website, catholicfamilynews.com, and we have a whole bunch of articles on there. We also have a whole lot of things on this channel. Click the subscribe button, click a like, help us spread the news about this. So from all of us here at Catholic Family News, may God grant you many joyful years.